Welcome to this session of the Bendigo Writers Festival. My name is Jeff Sparrow and I'll be facilitating for the next 45 minutes. The title of this session is On Borrowed Time. If you're not here for that title, you're in the wrong place, but stick around because I'm sure it's going to be a very, very interesting session. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that this venue stands on the land of the Dja Dja Wurrung and Tagaron people and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd like now to introduce the focus of this session, Professor Robert Manne, who really needs no introduction to this audience, but because it's my job, I will give you one nonetheless. He's an emeritus professor at La Trobe University. He's widely published across the Australian media, and he's the author of a great number of books, including the most recent essay collection, which we'll be talking about today, On Borrowed Time. Could you please join me in making him feel welcome? Robert, the most striking essay in a very striking collection of essays is the one that gives the collection its title. And it's an essay that begins with you waking in the middle of the night and discovering a lump in your throat, which turns out to be cancer. So before we go on to talk about some of the themes that you raise in that essay, I just wanted to ask you about your state of health now in the aftermath of that discovery.
Well, you see, I can speak as well as ever. It's a joke. The operation was, more than 18 months ago. In some ways, I'm more healthy, apart from this, than I ever was, because I've stopped drinking alcohol at all. And I am robust and can still do physical labour. And no sign of the cancer's return. You get checked occasionally. I'd be a fool to think it couldn't return, but it hasn't. So, I may live till the 90s, my 90s. I may not. So, I won't go into details. There's a lot of medical dramas. There's a tiny silicone prosthesis that allows me to speak, but often misbehaves. And I go to the hospital quite a lot to get it attended to. But in general, I'm robust. And about my health, probably foolishly rather optimistic.
Oh, well, I'm really pleased. In that essay, you touch on something which I think anyone who's had a brush with mortality like the one that you described will know the experience of suddenly being forced to re-examine the principles of your life and finding some of them suddenly more important, some of them less important. Was that your experience? And if so, what did you find falling away and what did you find coming to the forefront of your mind? When you suddenly realised you had a serious health problem, how did your thinking change?
Maybe the biggest change was that my life, if one thinks of it as a film, came more sharply into focus. And I realised that some things mattered to me fundamentally, some other things not so important. So what matters to me fundamentally, well, my wife, Anne, who's in the audience, my children, 2 daughters, my nephew, who's probably well known as a refugee lawyer. And also, I have to say, my political passion continues. I often used to joke that the reason I'd like to live for a long time is to see whether humanity is going to fail to rise to the challenge of climate change. Almost a curiosity. But anyhow, and what fell away, I suppose, is a kind of interest in day-to-day Australian politics. So I think about this situation of the refugees on Manus Island in Nauru. I think about that more in a way because of the extremity of what they're going through and what we are putting them through. I think less about whether what Tony Abbott's last mischief and so on. That strikes me as less interesting to me for a long time.
And the rest of the population too, I think.
Yes. For a long time, I saw that Australia was moving in a really positive direction under Keating. I saw it too late, but I saw it. And I've felt ever since the mid-90s that we've gone backwards in certain fundamental ways. And I am very angry about that, but I now feel less like I can influence it. I once thought I might be able to influence opinion against Howard and then Abbott. I now think it was unlikely, and I'm more or less reconciled to not being able to do much about that.
That first essay, perhaps unexpectedly, concludes, I think, as I said in a review for Fairfax, as a love letter to your partner, Anne. And it's a kind of writing that people maybe aren't accustomed so much to associating with you as a public intellectual. I know Anne herself has written a lot about the relationship between public and private, but that has tended to be something that women who are engaged in public life grapple with more than men. In the course of your illness and thinking about your life after that, is it something that you've thought about, the relationship between your public life as a prominent public intellectual and your personal relationships? Is it something that, like many men, I think, have often find themselves thinking that they wish they had spent more time on public life, on their private life rather than their public? Was that something that occurred to you in the wake of your illness?
Not exactly like that. I mean, I don't think I could have got through without Anne. And but in a way, I've always known that this would be the case, and I've always hoped that I'd be able to reciprocate if the tables are turned, and to overcome sort of selfish workaholism, which to some extent I have. But I think it may be true. I think it's true both that men in public life don't talk that much about their private lives. And I think people who are brushed with cancer, for some reason which I don't understand, become secretive. Now, I sound secretive because I whisper. But in fact, in a way, I've been rather private about, in my writing. But with this, I had a great urge, I think, to speak honestly about the experience. And I don't know why. In a way, this is a true story. When I wrote the piece, I thought it might be of no interest to anyone. And I sent it to a friend of mine, Alex Miller. Just said, is this of any interest? So I thought, knowing him, he'd be reasonably frank about it. And he said it will be of interest. And it has been. In a way, I'm a little bit miffed, because I've had more reaction to that essay than the 500 others that I've written on the things, that do concern me. But anyhow, I've been very touched. I had a letter recently from someone who'd gone through exactly what I've gone through. And he was almost shaking. You could see in the letter he was almost shaking with amazement that what he'd gone through was honestly public and written about without frills and without fear. So it surprised me a bit, but I have to say I'm pleased that it's got through to so many people.
The other resonance of the title of the latest collection, On Borrowed Time, pertains to another one of your long-standing preoccupations you touched on before, which is, of course, climate change. The New York Times Magazine recently put a special issue out entirely devoted to climate change, in which the argument was made that all of the science about climate change was well known and well established by the 1980s, that all the preconditions for doing something to stop climate change were in place then, but yet we did nothing. And this is a point that you've made as well. In fact, there was a time when almost every mainstream politician pledged to do something about climate change. In fact, we have gone backwards. How do you explain what has happened?
I mean, it's very hard to say it in a short space, but the science is more or less settled, apart from very detailed matters. The politics of it, why have human beings not risen to this challenge, is unsettled. We're all struggling to understand it. But one important thing that's happened, which I once believed could not have happened, which is the fossil fuel companies and the private enterprise think tanks in the United States have mysteriously turned a matter of science into a matter of ideology. I once wouldn't have believed it's possible. And also, of course, the conservatives in general used to mock the left for calling into doubt the solidity of science. I mean, I've been thinking about this for quite a while. Eventually, in America, one of the two parties is completely committed to denialism, and they have a president who's completely denialist. And that will it's a very major moment in the history of humankind. And so the story of the conversion of the Republicans to denialism through the work of first the fossil fuel companies and then the think tanks is one of the explanations. But there's also, other explanations which concern the psychology of consumption in late capitalism and the ways in which our societies have now come to take for granted, a very high level of consumption and satisfaction, and this fear that might be interfered with if we regarded this as a quasi-military emergency, which it is. And so there is individual psychology plays a role as well as political denialism.
Well, let me press you on that, because it seems to me particularly noteworthy in the Australian context. As you say, that there is no reputable scientist who doesn't accept the consensus about climate change. We're being told that the Great Barrier Reef is facing an existential crisis, yet we are incapable of doing something as simple as getting a ban on plastic bags in supermarkets. But this also seems to be happening at the same time as the political class find it impossible to make the simplest of reforms. So, for instance, I think of the same-sex marriage debate, where a reform that in many ways was not particularly radical, dragged on for years and years and years, eventually took a referendum to make it happen. Do you think the impasse that we are at with climate change is connected to a broader political dysfunction of some kind? And if so, what would be the nature of that dysfunction?
It's a hard question.
That's why we're here.
I mean, I do think that the role of ideas and principle in politics has diminished. And so it should be the case, Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister, he once held a view of climate change identical really to mine. And he lost the leadership of the party about it. It seems as if politicians no longer are capable of holding principles. Fringe parties might, but mainstream politicians can't. So what appears to be in Australia, which I know best, is just the struggle for political survival and preeminence. And because, the balance of forces are that he's got a right wing led by Abbott, who he is threatened by. He's been willing more or less to give up everything he once believed in. Even now, I once thought he had really believed in the Republic. He appears not to give a damn. I once thought he believed in multiculturalism, but he'll try to get elected on the basis of African gangs in Melbourne. So let's say Turnbull is typical of the kind of politician we now have. And that's a politician for whom principles are dispensable. And of course, you know, most issues are difficult and require real political guts. I think the last politician with true principle was Paul Keating, and he was hammered for it in '96. So, I mean, you know, I've recently read a biography of Gladstone, who I admire, 19th century. He was a Tory as a young man, became a radical liberal, but every second week he was thinking about resigning from cabinet on matters of principle. So why has that dissolved is a hard question, but I think it has. And, you know, there are interests that are threatened by reform, and those interests can rally politicians and even buy them, and there we have the problem.
Because in this book you have a long and very favourable review of Naomi Klein's climate change book, This Changes Everything, where Klein suggests that combating climate change will entail some kind of social transformation on a scale that we have not seen, I don't know, since the 1940s, perhaps a kind of mobilisation of the scale that was necessary to win the Second World War. We seem then to be in a situation where we need, as a matter of urgency, major structural change, yet, as you just suggest, we have a political class that has never been less capable of making arguments for anything. This seems a very bad situation to be in.
I mean, it seems a bad situation. I mean, in most public opinion polls, climate change is number 18 or 20 in the list of concerns compared to the economy or health or education or security. Climate change. Now, I was sitting lying on the couch in the summer, maybe I think it was about 2008, and I read Tim Flannery's book, The Weather Makers, and I had hardly read anything on climate change until then. And I had those, oh shit moments. I suddenly saw how serious this was. I mean, so serious that it makes everything else small. Future generations, in my view, will curse our generation, which, as you said at the beginning, saw in the late 80s the problem, and then has essentially achieved nothing in the fight against climate change. And coal-fired power stations are going up everywhere. None of the oil companies are stopping searching for more oil. And in a rational world, we would stop looking for fossil fuels. We'd ban it. And the political class would treat it, I'd be willing to say, not like the Second World War in terms of seriousness, but more serious. Because the grounds of human flourishing will be taken away from us if things go on. And yet, in a way, even newspapers think it's boring, and they find it hard to continue the discussion. It is in a way boring because one has to say the same things time and again. So, here am I, being boring. But it is, in my view, something that transcends everything else. And our generation, by accident, has been handed this problem.
In this book, you have a long essay about Wilfred Burchett, the Cold War journalist, in which you follow up some earlier writings that you did about Burchett in the past. You also write about contemporary figures, many of whom are regarded in the US in quite a similar way to Burchett, to how Burchett was regarded in the 1950s. I'm thinking about Chelsea Manning, I'm thinking about Edward Snowden, I'm thinking about Julian Assange. All three have been described as traitors. They've been calls by, I suppose, the fringes of the Republican Party for the death penalty to be applied to them. How would you distinguish between those figures? Is your attitude, your very favourable attitude to Snowden, for instance, compared to Burchett, a product of different conditions, or is it to do with you changing your mind about the nature of dissent?
Yeah, another very good question. Look, the difference is simple. Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, Assange, question mark now for me. did not fight on behalf of a totalitarian power. I mean, in my view, and in a way this is where we might differ a bit, the communists of the past did not see that they were supporting a monstrous tyranny. A monstrous tyranny. Why was I hostile to Burchard? Why am I still? I think he's a brave man. In some ways not a good journalist, but a brave journalist. He made the choice for Stalin and for Kim Il-sung in North Korea and for Mao Zedong in China, and eventually was being paid by the KGB, which is what's in the book. And that's the difference. Snowden, in my view, is of immaculate character and political judgment, and an American patriot, seeing, the abuses of intelligence. Chelsea Manning, similarly, although more complicated because she was involved in, sex change, and, she's a complicated figure. Simply, Assange is complicated. We could talk about it if you want. But say of those people, Edward Snowden or Naomi Klein, I regard they are not attached to the Soviet Union. Now, I think the great tragedy of the left in the 20th century was that it didn't see through the Soviet Union and other communist countries. So my heroes of that when I was a young man were those who saw through it but were socialists. Most famously George Orwell, but there were others. So that's the difference. I mean,
Major Trotskyists of you yet, Robert.
Yeah, but even the Trotskyists didn't see through Lenin, which is a different question.
Well, let me get back to this, though. I mean, because anyone who looks at your collected essays, one of them was called Left, Right, Left, which neatly encapsulates your political trajectory. Your politics have moved in one direction. Many others who were associated with the anti-communist movement have moved in another direction. Why didn't that happen to you? Why didn't you become Tony Abbott?
The reason is that I realised once the Cold War was over, my connections in general to the right were thin. Some of you will remember that I edited Quadrant, and I really made it a politically ecumenical magazine. And me and my close friend Raymond Gator very seriously took up the Aboriginal issue, which we hadn't before. He wrote on Mabo and other matters, and I wrote on Stolen Generations. And for example, I'll give you a little example. The anti-communists were absolute on the question of refugees, because the refugees from communism. But I was shocked that when the refugees from Iran or Saddam Hussein's Iraq or Afghanistan under the Taliban, they forgot everything and they became hostile to refugees. So in some ways I think I was more stuck to what I believed, whereas I saw people. And then I didn't support the Vietnam War as a student. I marched against it even though I was becoming an anti-communist. But I was really appalled that the people I was associated with not only supported the invasion of Iraq, but were behind it. I could never have become Tony Abbott, but I could have become the Australian version of the neocons in America, Bill Kristol and others like that. And I didn't. And then why didn't I? Because I knew issues interested me, like the Indigenous one and later climate change. But because I thought for myself on these issues.
Well, I was going to ask you about the development of Quadrant. As you say, you edited it for many years. Today, it has become associated with really all of the issues that you are most hostile to. It's assiduously anti-immigrant, it's incredibly hostile to Indigenous politics, it's Islamophobic. Do you think, looking back at your editorship of that, could that have ended differently? Was there a way that split in the movement that you were involved with could have gone in a different direction? Was there something that could have happened to have avoided that, or was it inevitable within the context of the movement?
I think it was inevitable. The people in charge of Quadrant were standard right-wingers, conservatives. I was moving leftwards, and but in a way I felt in bad faith, because there were some people who were moving similarly with me, like Raymond Gator, although he was always more to the left. Like Martin Krieger, Professor of Law, was moving in the same direction as me, but it was a small group, and the magazine had come to represent intellectual conservatism, and I was changing that. Maybe I could have stuck around, but I felt sort of in bad faith. It's like an editor of The Guardian realising they are a Thatcherite. And, I think they have to jump ship, and in a way I jumped ship. I was put under a bit of pressure, but I felt in bad faith in the end that I couldn't lead a magazine, which was the only intellectually conservative magazine of serious importance in Australia, while my politics were all, in a way, moving leftwards. So it really couldn't have ended differently. And then they appointed Paddy McGuinness, and then, to my real horror, one of the people I most fear in Australia, Keith Windshuttle, a former leftist, extreme leftist who's become an extreme rightist, and unfortunately that represents the trajectory of conservatism in the country, and I was the one that had to jump ship.
You recently reviewed Barry Butani's book, No Friend But the Mountains, which is an extraordinary account of life on Manus Island. And it's a book one can't help but read without thinking about the tradition of prison literature, which is much of which is associated with the gulags, which you, as an anti-communist, opposed. Did you ever imagine that in 2018 we would be in a situation where, as Richard Flanagan says in the introduction to the book, this is very much an Australian story, but it's an Australian story about a gulag? Did you ever imagine we would end up in a situation like this?
No. It took 20 years of, bad politics to get there. And what you say is absolutely true. It's a magnificent book. It's a kind of miracle that amongst the 2,000 who've been marooned, imprisoned, destroyed by us, one of them is a world-class writer, which I hadn't realised until I read his book, a few weeks ago. It's a magnificent book, an honest book, unexpected in many ways, and it can be read in the way one reads Primo Levi or Alexander Solzhenitsyn, except that he's writing it while he's going through the experience, and except that it is Australia that's doing it to him. I really never thought that could happen. And it's painful reflection on what we've become, that could happen. And so what do you say? I am totally surprised by it. Was surprised. I would have 20 years ago said, come off it.
So refugee policy in Australia is in some ways a little bit like, the fable of the frog in the boiling water, a matter of incremental abuses. Looking back on it from where we are now, is there a moment where this course was fixed? Is there a moment where we could have done otherwise? And if so, what was that moment? Why did we miss it?
I differ from most of the left on this. When Kevin Rudd got rid of the Howard policy and allowed boats to return, a huge number of boats started arriving. And I don't think any Australian government, if the trajectory had continued, could have put up with, tens of thousands arriving each year. I don't think any government in the world could. So I don't think we could have just been compassionate and got away with it. But I think Rudd has a lot to answer for, because when he returned to power, he didn't need to say the people on Manus and Nauru will never come to Australia ever. And he now says, I talked privately to him about it recently, he now says that he meant only for 1 year. And he wants to show me documents to prove it. But he said it, and he knew he should have known that Abbott was going to be Prime Minister. And Abbott would leap upon that and would use it in every way. And so I suppose one moment is that Rudd shouldn't have said they'll never come to Australia. But honestly, my favourite essay in the book is the one which tries to explain 5 or 6 major arguments about how we became what we have. And, perhaps say one thing of that. I think it's not racism behind the policy, but immigration absolutism. The White Australia policy, not the racist part of it, but for several decades, not one non-white was to be admitted to Australia, and now not one boat will be allowed to arrive. And so I think that the immigration culture of control, as it's been called, the department's culture of control, is one of the big reasons, as well as ordinary political opportunism. But it's a salutary tale as to what can come, and there you get at the end of it, you get a world-class writer writing on behalf of people whose lives have for no reason been destroyed. And my argument is, where I differ from the left, I think I have to say people can be brought from Nauru and Manus Island without any return of the boats if our Navy continues to patrol the shores, patrol the oceans. And that's a difficult thing for me to say. And once you say it, you vacate the high moral ground. But I don't see any other way out of it. I don't think there can be a return to 2013. But, it almost gives me sleepless nights to think about the people we're destroying. Not, it's often said, there are means to an end. It's not even that. There's no end. They could be brought to Australia tomorrow and nothing would change.
We rapidly run out of time, but there is one other thing that I wanted to ask you about, another recent piece of writing of yours, which was in The Guardian, a response to Andrew Bolt's extraordinary piece in which he said that we are facing a foreign invasion that's colonising Australia, and he listed all the various ethnicities that were supposedly colonising Australia, including the Jews of Caulfield. We've had that piece.
North Caulfield.
We've had that piece, and then a few days later we had the neo-Nazi leader Blair Cottrell appearing on Sky TV. A very sympathetic interview. We've been talking just previously about some of the horrors of the 20th century. The obvious horror that is brought into mind by these events is the return of some form of fascism, and we are seeing variants of that happening all across Australia, with this extraordinary normalisation of what seems to me overtly fascistic rhetoric. Do you think there's a potential for some sort of far-right breakthrough in Australia? We've seen the rise, but also subsequently the decline of One Nation, and that space seems to have been vacated in some ways. Do you think that's a possibility?
Yeah, it's funny you should say that, because that's what I'm thinking of writing next. What is happening in the world, it seems to me, in Europe and the States, is I don't call it fascism, I think it's white ethno-nationalism. Trump is the leader. Boris Johnson is trying to do it in Britain and may very well succeed. Viktor Orban in Hungary is proclaimed illiberalism as his doctrine. What's emerging, I think, and it's the biggest story apart from climate change, the biggest story is the emergence of white ethno-nationalism. And your question is, will it come to Australia? And the honest answer is we don't know. There are people trying. Obviously Pauline Hanson, but I don't want to be offensive, but she's a fool.
God be thanked for the incompetence of our enemies.
Viktor Orban is not a fool.
Yeah.
Even Trump, in a way, is not a fool, or not in the way she is. Someone I used to like, for God's sake, Mark Latham, would love to lead the movement, except, to be honest, he's so uncharming that I don't think he'll succeed. So we don't yet, and one of the possibilities is if Bill Shorten wins the next election, which on balance he's likely to, Dutton may be the leader of the Liberal Party after Turnbull. And then you would have an interesting lineup in Australia of, let's call it, neo-social democratic sort of opportunism on the one hand, and on the other, white ethno-nationalism on the other. So, that might be the way. On the other hand, Australia might be the exception and might be able to avoid this buzz. And, what you're doing, what I'm trying to do, is trying to influence things so that Australia doesn't move in that direction. But what Bolt wrote the other day was new to even to him, I think. And that was to say, the white nations are being overtaken by Muslims and people with dark skins who are invading, and we're losing our country. That's what Trump is saying very successfully. Make America great again is to return to the preeminence of the whites against the Muslims and the people of colour. That's what very wittily Boris Johnson would try to do. He'd, quote Virgil or something while doing it.
Power, yeah.
So I think what you've touched on then is the big question of politics, leaving aside climate change.
Good times. We're rapidly running out of time. We would like to get at least a couple of questions in.
Robert, I've shared your journey with life-threatening illness and the way it can focus our preferences, our priorities. And I'm not sure that my question shouldn't be directed to Anne rather than you, but at 71, I find my hearing and my sight are not what they were. And when I read the introduction to your session, I read the second line, his love of life intensified as his love life intensified.
Okay.
Would you care to comment?
I didn't write that, I promise you. No, Anne and I have shared lives together for 30-something years. I don't feel it's ever been more or less intense. I think it's been full forever, since we knew each other. So I would say to that, what the true part of it is, I've recognised, I suppose, even more strongly than I did, that's what, in times of difficulty, one relies on. So it's more that than a kind of intensification of love, which was as intense in my case as it could ever be.
Something else I want to ask you before we leave this session. I mean, if we go back to what we started with, the brush with mortality, it forces one to think about the future and what lies ahead. You have children and grandchildren. What kind of work? No?
Not yet.
Okay. Well, perhaps. What future do you predict for them? I mean, what do you think the planet will be looking like in, say, 30, 40 years' time?
I think it's grim, because, if we go on as we do, and by that time there'll be several billion more people, if fossil fuels drive their energy, if Africa goes through economic change, miracle on the basis of fossil fuels, the oceans will be drowning the cities. There'll be huge numbers of climate refugees. There'll be a scrabble for resources and comfort. Very nasty politics, I think, would emerge on the basis of that scramble. So, I actually think it's going, the rich and the privileged will gatehouse themselves, find areas to live. They'll exclude the majority and they'll bar refugees on the basis of climate. So it's a grim and it's a dark future I think we have. And it's almost now unavoidable. And that's in a way why I want to go on living, apart from my wife and children, to see it. Because, as a historian, I'm curious about the human condition as well as driven passionately to try and influence things a little bit. But I think as the climate takes its vengeance on our selfishness, politics will go in very dark directions, I think.
Well, we are living on borrowed time unless we do something to change it. I'd like you to join me in thanking Professor Robert Manne for a very interesting session.